11. Jane had been asleep for several hours when she saw the image of the little village. She was alone in the dream, at least at its beginning, without any guides or emissaries from that world. Nevertheless, she knew immediately, instinctively, that the sun-baked collection of thatch and bamboo huts was a village in Thailand, a village not far from Bangkok, in fact. Jane also grasped, in that instinctual manner of dreams, that the village was as remote in time as it was near in place. She was seeing the village as it had existed perhaps 70 or 80 years ago, when Westerners had referred to Thailand as Siam, and Americans would have regarded the country as impossibly distant and exotic. There were no cars in this village crisscrossed by pathways of reddish-brown mud. There probably weren't many automobiles in the entire nation back then. The rice paddies on either side of the village were maintained by a combination of water buffalo and brute human power. Something was compelling Jane to walk toward one of the little bamboo and thatch huts. There was nothing externally distinctive about this particular hut, but some force told Jane, "Go there." Or perhaps it was a force inside the hut that said, "Come here." Jane walked through the darkened doorway of the hut, which was obscured in shadow, even in this, the hottest part of the day. The hut consisted of one largish room. The first thing Jane noticed was Kaji's doll, little Lawan, propped upright in one corner of the room, as if watching the unfolding scene. Jane was not alone in the hut with the doll. There was an adolescent girl, obviously Thai, bending over a crib that contained an infant. Following the revelatory pattern of the dream thus far, Jane knew immediately that the infant was the adolescent girl's younger sibling. The adolescent girl ignored both Jane and the doll. She was far more concerned with checking the doorway and the hut's sole window. She wanted to make sure that no one was observing her. As so often occurs in disturbing dreams, Jane tried in vain to cry out when she realized what the young girl was about to do. Jane watched from a short distance as the girl wrapped both hands around her infant sister's neck and began to squeeze. There was a context here that Jane suddenly became aware of. At the beginning of her life, the adolescent girl had been the center of the household, the sole recipient of her parents' attentions. But this situation was not to last. Her mother had given birth to others. Each time, a new baby had displaced the firstborn girl as the center of attention. The girl had resented this, and so she had taken action, now, for the third time in a little more than 4 years. 12. Still lost in the dream, Jane looked again at Kaji's doll in the corner of the room, little Lawan. Now Jane understood. Kaji's LUK THEP doll had been infused with the soul of one of these murdered infants from so long ago. After the passage of so many years, the murdered infant's parents would have long since died, so there was no one to mourn them. But one of those innocents could live on in the LUK THEP. Perhaps it was not such a bad thing after all, and Kaji did seem to love the doll named Lawan. Jane suddenly became aware of another presence in the room, a male presence. It was the father of the household, an early middle-aged man clad in peasant work clothing and a conical hat. He had just returned from laboring in the fields. Although he had not seen his eldest daughter strangle the infant, he was confronted with the circumstantial evidence, the older sister, the blue-faced, strangled baby. These were circumstances that he had seen before. As if sharing the man's feelings, Jane felt a mixture of hurt, rage, and horror well up inside her. The man grasped the situation now, what the older daughter was doing. Perhaps he had been in denial before. What father wouldn't want to deny such a thing? But the third time was one time too many. Denial was no longer possible. Confronted with this, the father had an evil thought of his own. Jane shared his thoughts, a dark set of intentions that spanned the gap of culture, language, and time. This is an evil little girl of mine who has killed her younger sisters. I will kill this evil child, this killer of other children, and bury her in my fields. Lawan, the father shrieked, and then in Thai, "What have you done? You are a wicked child, a curse." The man was crying now. What evil did I commit in my past lives to suffer such an evil child from my loins? The father moved toward the girl to strangle the strangler. Just then the girl's mother burst in. The mother attempted to intervene on the girl's behalf, but only half-heartedly. She had long ago suspected what her husband was just now accepting. "Yes, my husband," she said, as the man wrapped his hands around the terrified, guilty girl's neck. "This is what must happen. There is no way we could live with Lawan as our daughter now that we know what she has done." Jane did not want to watch the parents murder their sole surviving child before burying her in the fields, where she would likely lie beside the siblings she had murdered. It was a compound tragedy, and a truly evil one, from multiple perspectives. The hut began to fade as the dream abruptly dissolved into the murky waters of deep sleep, then waking. Jane sat bolt upright in her bed, gasping for air. Shivering, Jane rolled over in bed, telling herself over and over again, it was only a dream. It was only a dream. It wasn't real. Then came another realization. Lawan, the name of Kaji's LUK THEP doll, was not the name of one of the murdered innocents. Lawan had been the name of the older sister, the one who had killed them. 13. Some hours later, Jane had checked out of her hotel room, and yet another taxi ride had taken her to Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi airport. An ultra-modern airport of gleaming marble and polished metal, it might have been the ideal setting to forget all about the doll, the dream, and the unthinkable notion that their juxtaposition suggested. But the airport was also filled with statues and other motifs of grinning, unfamiliar Hindu and Buddhist deities. Jane wanted no more of the spirit world of Thailand. She sat at the Delta departure gate, sipping a black coffee, waiting to board the plane that would return her to snowy Michigan. She was surrounded by a mixed group of travelers. The conversations around her were both in Thai and in English. To avoid thinking about the dream, Jane allowed her thoughts to return to more earthbound matters. Namely, the issue concerning RAM and the new components supplier in Vietnam. Automakers like Ford, GM, Toyota, and Volkswagen didn't manufacture most of their own components. Each company relied on a complex supply chain consisting of hundreds, even thousands, of external suppliers. Within the automotive industry, companies like TRX Automotive were known as Tier 1 suppliers. TRX Automotive sold directly to the automakers. TRX shipped its completed ignition systems straight to the automakers' plants, where they were assembled into vehicles, which were subsequently sold to consumers. But TRX Automotive didn't make all of its own components either. Within any ignition system sold by TRX to an automaker, there were dozens of subcomponents manufactured by outside companies. These companies, the suppliers of the Tier 1 suppliers, were known as Tier 2 suppliers. TRX was responsible for the management of its Tier 2 suppliers, and these suppliers were located all over the world, but mostly in developing Asian nations like China, India, the Philippines, and Vietnam, and of course Thailand, where TRX had a manufacturing plant. The political situations in many developing countries were complicated, but this was especially the case in Thailand. 2 years ago, a group of Thai generals had orchestrated a takeover of the national government. This was the 12th such coup to occur in Thailand since the early 1930s. Since the most recent coup, the country had been governed by a military junta, with the acquiescence of the Thai monarchy. The junta could and did exert its influence over business activities, particularly the business activities of foreign companies operating inside Thailand. That said, it was by no means a one-sided relationship. The foreign companies had a certain degree of leverage. The generals relied on foreign investment to keep Thailand's economy going, thereby preventing a counter-revolution. But the relationship was still unequal. If a foreign company incurred the concentrated wrath of the junta, it would certainly find the operating environment within Thailand to be more difficult and expensive. Necessary permits would be mysteriously delayed or denied. Government safety inspectors would suddenly find violations of regulations that no one had ever heard of before. There were many subtle ways for the ruling generals to interfere. They did not need to send in tanks to crash a foreign company's gates. Ram, in addition to being a deputy plant manager, was rumored to have financial ties to one of the generals who sat on the ruling junta. Ram was also rumored to have connections to the Tier 2 subcomponent supplier that had recently been replaced. There was, of course, corruption in Vietnam, where the new supplier was located. In Vietnam, however, the controlling factor was not the Thai military junta, but the Communist Party of Vietnam. Ram had no influence or connections in the CPV, and therefore no chance to sell influence or otherwise profit. The entire situation was frustrating. But TRX Automotive relied heavily on its manufacturing facility in Thailand. Jane, as a representative of headquarters, was charged with maintaining harmonious relations with her Thai counterparts. She had rumors about the deputy plant manager's corrupt practices, but no solid proof. The friction with Ram was therefore a circumstance that Jane would have to manage. She was thankful that she had allies within the Thai subsidiary, conscientious employees like Kaji. There was corruption in Thailand, to be sure, but many Thais held themselves above it. Thank goodness for Kaji, yes, but Jane felt an increasingly familiar chill ripple through her. 14. Thoughts of Kaji inevitably looped back to thoughts of the doll, thoughts of the disturbing dream. The doll named Lawan, and the adolescent girl named Lawan, the girl who had murdered her younger siblings before being murdered by her father. The dream had indicated a fairly clear connection between the murderous, doomed young girl and the doll in Kaji's office. For a moment, Jane wondered, should she call Kaji, or perhaps send her an email about the dream? Make some attempt to warn her about the doll? And what exactly would she type in such an email? Dear Kaji, you know that doll in your office, the one that's supposed to be haunted? Well, I'm quite certain that it's haunted, by the spirit of a malevolent little girl, one who killed her infant siblings, and was then murdered by her father decades ago. I have a feeling that the doll might be dangerous. That would go over quite well, wouldn't it? TRX Automotive, like most corporate entities, reserved the right to scan its employees' emails. Jane imagined the guffaws of the folks in the IT department when they read that one. More to the point, Jane imagined her subsequent conversations with human resources, with her boss, Martin Tully. Maybe your current position as Asian supply chain manager is too stressful, Martin would say. Maybe you need to step back, take a less demanding position. Martin would then make a gentle suggestion that Jane should consider other, less stressful career options. No, there was no way, given the realities of their professional relationship and corporate politics, that Jane could warn Kaji about the doll. And besides, there was probably nothing to warn her about. Not really. Jane didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in superstitions like Friday the 13th and the unlucky auras of black cats. Her imagination, she decided, had taken a brief flight of fancy because of a combination of circumstances. The spookily realistic doll in a dark, unfamiliar office late at night, combined with jet lag, fatigue, and the sort of confrontation with Ram in the hallway. What about the dream, though? Well, the more she thought about it, that too could be explained. Jane didn't read a lot of crime fiction or horror fiction. Most of the books she read nowadays were business titles by authors like Seth Godin. She also read USA Today with some regularity and the Wall Street Journal. She had, however, made numerous visits to various locations in Asia. The dream scene in the little hut was likely a composite of scenarios that her subconscious had absorbed during her business trips to the Far East. And as for the distance in time that the dream conveyed, well, she had certainly seen old period films. It wasn't inconceivable to think of all these disparate elements blending together to form a single, unified nightmare. It was time to forget about the doll, forget about the dream. When she touched down in Michigan, an entirely new set of deadlines and problems would await her. With this prospect in mind, she pulled out her phone, which had a generous international data and calling plan, and began to go through her sundry inboxes. There was a text message from Martin Tully about a quality problem with a new supplier in the Philippines and an invoicing issue with another supplier in Taiwan. She also responded to David's latest email and thought about his imminent return. She wondered briefly if he was remaining faithful to her over in Germany, surrounded by all those Fräuleins, not to mention women from Eastern Europe. She reminded herself, for the umpteenth time, that she hadn't yet slept with him. Their relationship had just been advancing to that threshold before he'd left. Jane had narrowly decided to make him wait until he returned from his assignment in Germany. He wasn't going off to the wars, after all, but only to a corporate assignment in Europe. Jane didn't want to sleep with a man for the first time and then have him take off for a months-long posting on the far side of the world. That was a formula for heartache, as she knew all too well from experience. But while you could give in to a man too soon, it was also possible to make a man wait too long. If David was still devoted to her on his return, she was going to take the next step, she decided. She was glad to have David to think about. She heard one of the people at the Delta counter click on the loudspeaker and announce that boarding would begin now on her Michigan-bound flight. Jane switched off her phone and returned it to her pocket. The previous night's dream was finally beginning to acquire the indistinct haziness that a dream should properly have. Nevertheless, Jane was glad to be leaving Thailand behind her. 15. It was several weeks later, and Jane had all but forgotten about the doll, the dream, and even the friction with Ram. She had exchanged a few routine emails with Kaji to confirm that all was going smoothly with the new supplier in Vietnam. There were no problems to speak of, and Jane turned her attention to other issues, of which there were plenty. She also readied herself for David Haley's return. Less than a week now. Jane could hardly wait. Jane returned from a hurried lunch one day to find a large cardboard box placed atop her desk. It was not wholly unusual for such containers to be delivered directly to her office. When there were quality problems with a component within Jane's sphere of responsibility, a plant quality manager would sometimes box up a sample of the defective parts and ship them to Jane for her reference and personal inspection. This was a practice that Jane encouraged, where appropriate. When she needed to describe a quality problem to a supplier representative located 6 or 8 time zones away, a man or a woman who spoke English as a second language, the task was made much easier if Jane had a sample of the offending components in her hands. Sometimes she snapped photos of the components and emailed them to the supplier representative before calling. As Jane approached the box, she noticed right away that it bore the return address label of the TRX automotive plant in Thailand. Kaji Wongsuwan's information had been written with a black felt-tip pen. As Jane began to tear open the box, her first assumption was that it would contain, as usual, defective mass production components. Her only hope was that these wouldn't be components from the new supplier in Vietnam. There would be no end to Ram's gloating, and he would immediately lobby to get the old supplier reinstated. The size and weight of the box suggested a collection of large, fragile parts, definitely portions of an ignition system's electronic circuitry, rather than one of the heavier housings. She lifted open the top flaps of the box and then removed a covering of several styrofoam sheets. Then she caught a glimpse of the object that had been shipped to her attention. Her initial immediate impression was that someone from Thailand had sent her a severed human head, for the first thing she saw of the main contents of the box was a length of braided black hair. But not even the wildest flight of fancy could permit this impression to persist for long. There were limits to what Jane could believe, even after that disturbing dream she had in Thailand, a dream that she now rarely thought about. Jane almost screamed, though, when the overhead fluorescent lights of her office revealed exactly what Kaji had, in fact, sent her. Little Lawan, the LUK THEP, the angel-slash-spirit doll, was seated in the box amid a pile of styrofoam chips. Lawan was clad in the same red and white dress, her pigtails as neat and tightly braided as they had been when Jane had seen her a few weeks ago in Kaji's office in Thailand. The doll looked exactly as she had in the dream, sitting in the corner of the hut while the adolescent girl murdered her latest sibling. 16. For a moment, Jane believed that she was going to swoon. Suddenly, she had an image of the Thai doll climbing into the box by its own power, then closing the flaps of the box above its head so that it could make the journey to America. That was ridiculous, needless to say. As ridiculous as Kaji shipping this, of all things, to her all the way from Thailand. What the hell? There was a note in Lawan's lap. Now Jane was once again catching flashbacks from the dream, the murderous girl in her early teens, doing what she had done to her infant siblings, All three of them. Nevertheless, Jane was able to summon the objectivity needed to make a crucial discernment. The note was not from Lawan, either Lawan the doll, or Lawan, the girl in the dream. The note was from Kaji, the very human Kaji, who had now sent her an inexplicable package. Perhaps the note would provide an explanation. The note was written in blue ink, in Kaji's hand. Despite Kaji's otherwise fluent English, the hand-printed letters revealed Kaji's lack of intimate familiarity with the shapes of the Latin alphabet. The letters curved and swirled like the Thai script. Kaji's words were legible, however. "Dear Jane, I hope you're well. As for me, I have great news. I met the most wonderful man. His name is Tom, and he's British. Tom works for a multinational here in Thailand. I think that Tom and I will end up getting married. This means that I'll have children of my own, and I won't need Lawan anymore. I've therefore decided to give Lawan to you, Jane, in order that Lawan may bring you happiness. As she has brought me happiness, take care. Yours truly, Kaji Wongsuwon." Just then, someone spoke behind her, a male voice. "Jane, there you are. I was looking for you." Jane turned and saw that her boss, Martin Tully, had walked in. Martin was in his mid-40s. He had the bearing and gently declining physique of a former athlete who now spent most of his waking hours in a corporate setting. Martin had walked in while Jane was opening the box. "I wanted to check the status of the Santos Electronics issue," Martin said. "I have to go into a board meeting this afternoon. The production VPs are going to want to know where we stand." Santos Electronics was a TRX automotive supplier located in the Philippines outside Manila. There had recently been quality problems with the components Santos manufactured. "I think we're okay now," Jane said. "They've improved their work-in-process inspection procedures, and the defect rate has gone way down, close to zero. I'll forward you an email that has all of the relevant details." Martin nodded. "That's good news." "Thanks, Jane." Martin looked over her shoulder at the open box. "Hey, I don't mean to be nosy, but that looks like a—" "It is," Jane said. "It's a doll." "Wow, I don't think I've ever seen a doll quite like that." Martin made as if to step closer to the box, to examine the doll, and then he paused. "May I?" "Sure," Jane said, "though I'm not sure why anyone would want to get close to that thing. 17. Martin peered down into the box where Lawan sat, smiling her eternal smile. Somewhat to Jane's surprise, his reaction was not revulsion, but a mixture of admiration and awe. "Very realistic," he said. "What kind of a doll is that?" "It's called a LUK THEP." Jane then gave Martin a brief explanation of the concept of the spirit doll and how the dolls were popular among educated, affluent, childless women in Thailand. Jane summarized Kaji's note and the Thai woman's purported reason for giving away the doll. "That's an interesting custom," Martin said. "Where do you plan to put it? That's the sort of thing that might look good in a display case in your home." The thought of Lawan in her condo filled Jane with a mixture of disgust and dread. There was no way she could fall asleep with Lawan under the same roof. "I think I'm going to send it back to Kaji," Jane said, more sharply than she had intended. "To tell you the truth, the doll gives me the creeps, and I certainly didn't ask for it." "Whoa, whoa!" Martin's brows furrowed. "I understand that tastes vary, but I'm sure that Kaji was only trying to be kind. I remember meeting her when she visited headquarters last year. She's a nice woman. Seems to be very considerate. A team player." "You're right," Jane said. "She is." Jane recalled Kaji's constant assistance with work matters, the change to the Vietnamese supplier, and everything since then. Jane was now able to focus on other suppliers in other countries because Kaji was so capably handling the situation in Thailand. "If you don't want the doll," Martin said, "then fine, give it away. You can throw it away even, though I think that would be a terrible waste. The doll looks expensive." "It is." Jane recalled the amount that Kaji had paid for the doll, and its equivalent in dollars. "But don't send the doll back, Jane, please. That would be insulting. We've both spent a lot of time in Asian cultures, and we both are aware of the importance of gift-giving in that region of the world. Asians seem to particularly enjoy giving us cultural artifacts, which is nice for us, because they have some really beautiful handiwork over there. My house looks like an Asian culture museum. Beautiful stuff." Martin paused and nodded in appreciation, no doubt picturing the gifts from Japan, Korea, and elsewhere that adorned his home. "So I see this doll, Jane, as just another one of those items. It's a little atypical, sure, but let's keep this in perspective. That doll was made in a factory out of plastic and synthetic materials. What I'm saying is, it's not like Kaji sent you a shrunken head from New Guinea." Jane had to agree that Martin had made a valid argument. Like Martin, Jane had received many gifts from overseas business contacts over the years, and a handful of them were mildly macabre. She owned a grimacing kabuki mask from Japan that, according to the explanation she had received, was supposed to depict a Japanese oni, or devil. She also had a small statuette of a skeleton dressed in traditional Mexican garb. The statuette had been made by hand to celebrate Mexico's Day of the Dead festival in early November. These items did not bother her. So why should she become so overwrought by a doll? It was, as Martin had duly noted, nothing more than a mass-produced collection of synthetic parts. From an analytical perspective, Lawan should be no more repellent or threatening than an ignition system made in one of TRX Automotive's factories. The dream was her sticking point, of course. Had she allowed her subconscious to psyche her out? And if she yielded to that self-imposed intimidation now, how would it manifest itself in the future? Today, she was afraid of a doll. Tomorrow, her subconscious might make her afraid of mirrors or clowns. Fear could easily become a slippery slope. Perhaps it would actually be a good idea for her to take the doll home, at least for a little while. That would force her to confront the spooky feelings that had been troubling her ever since she had first laid eyes on the doll in Kaji's office. She didn't have to keep it forever. After a month or two with the doll in her condo, she could sell it on eBay if she didn't want it. Such an outcome wouldn't be problematic, from a psychological perspective. That would be nothing more than the rational disposal of an item that didn't fit her taste and the decor of her home. But to throw away the doll now would be an act of instinctual, gut-level panic. It would represent a willing submission to fear, a cowering to superstition. "Perhaps you're right, Martin," she said. "Maybe I can find a place for this in my condo after all." 18. Having brought Lawan home, Jane discovered that she had no place for it/her, or rather, there was no place in her condominium's main living area where the doll could reside without being an eyesore. Once again, Jane considered the path of least resistance. There was a common dumpster behind her condo unit. She could toss Lawan in there, and within a day she would be covered with trash. Another day, and the garbage service company would take her to the incinerator, which would probably be the best place for her. Then she remembered what Martin had said, and what she had added to Martin's observations. To simply pitch the doll in the trash would be wasteful, paranoid, and superstitious. She thought again of Kaji's purported reason for giving the doll away. Kaji hadn't yet emailed Jane a photo of the dashing British businessman. Jane wondered how Tom might compare to her David. Not that she was interested in orchestrating a trade, mind you, just wondering, from a woman-to-woman perspective. Kaji had been so interested in hearing about David, so interested in seeing David's photo, that Jane would have expected the Thai woman to email her a photo of Tom. During her lunch hour, she had looked for Kaji on Facebook. Kaji did have a profile that was updated only infrequently. Her last post was dated nearly 6 months prior. It showed Kaji and some other well-dressed, obviously affluent young Thai women enjoying drinks at a resort, probably Pattaya or Koh Samui. Jane had been unable to glean any significant context from Kaji's Facebook profile as it was written in Thai. But at any rate, she had yet to see any evidence that Tom actually existed. He had to exist, though, right? Why else would Kaji give away a spirit doll that she had paid all those baht for? The main living area of Jane's condo consisted of a connected foyer, living room, and kitchen. After tentatively placing Lawan in several places about this area, Jane ruled out the entire sector. She had a large curio cabinet in the living room. This was where her Oni kabuki mask and Day of the Dead statuette resided. Lawan could have fit inside the curio cabinet, though it would have been a bit of a tight fit. But there were limits to what Jane was willing to do in order to allay her concerns that she was succumbing to paranoia. Keeping the doll was one thing, looking at it constantly was something else. Why not just toss the thing in the closet then? There was enough space on the floor of her hall closet. She could place Lawan behind her spare coats and her spare set of luggage. Then she was struck by a mental image of the doll rebelling against such an undignified placement. As Jane began to open the closet door, she imagined tiny hands pushing aside her empty suitcases and winter coats. And that would be what she would imagine each time the building settled during the long, cold Michigan nights. That was crazy, to be sure, but this entire situation was crazy. Thailand's LUK THEP doll craze represented an off-kilter custom by any objective measure. The unsettling dream had been like no dream Jane had ever had before. And as for Kaji sending the doll to her, well, that was crazy too. Jane finally decided on a compromise. She would stow the doll in a location that was neither too central to her life nor too removed, a place where she would encounter the doll sporadically, but not during virtually every minute of her time at home. She knew just the place. 19. Like most single adults who lived alone, even in a condominium or apartment, Jane's living space had a spare room. The spare room was vacant, a room where she stored a mishmash of items, extra clothes, spare dishes, and personal papers. There was an old desk in one corner of the room that she never used. This was also Dusty's room. The previous summer, during a particularly lonely spell, Jane had gone to a shelter and adopted a yearling cat, a black-brown striped neutered male whom she'd named Dusty. The decision hadn't been completely whimsical. Jane was a lifelong cat lover, and she'd owned several cats before. Nevertheless, she had been aware of the clichés, the spinster woman and her cats. That was before David. She now had a boyfriend and a cat. For the time being, at least, her life was no longer in danger of becoming a cliché. Dusty occupied the spare room to the extent that a cat can be said to occupy a room. Jane kept the cat's bed there, a large wicker basket with a sewn-in, thick yellow cushion for bedding. Atop several sheets of newspapers spread on the floor, she maintained Dusty's food and water bowls. The litter box was in there, too. Dusty was blissfully sleeping on the living room sofa when Jane walked into the spare room with Lawan. As ever, Jane was repulsed by the doll, but she could will herself to handle it. She still did not like to look at Lawan's too realistic face, nor to stare too long into her lifelike synthetic eyes. On the uppermost level of the bookcase at the back of the room, there was an empty space that seemed perfectly suited to Lawan. Here, the doll would technically be on display. It would not be hidden in the back of a closet or inside a storage trunk, let alone thrown away. Jane would face Lawan's creepy, smiling visage at least once a day, when she refilled Dusty's dishes and emptied the litter box. But the doll would not occupy a spot in the middle of her living area. "Here," Jane said, carefully lifting Lawan to the top shelf and scooting her into position. "You can keep Dusty company." Jane realized that she had just now spoken to the thing, as Kaji might have done. Speaking to the doll as if it were a real little girl was probably the first stage of the delusion. Jane vowed never to talk to the doll again. 20. For the remainder of the evening, Jane all but forgot about Lawan. In the electronic age of email and smartphones, a corporate employee of Jane's rank was never truly off the clock. Even though she was at home, she had TRX automotive business to see to. Also, there was David's return to anticipate. His emails had been increasing in frequency over the past week, she'd noticed. Perhaps he hadn't been seduced by a blonde Frolin after all. All of these pleasanter, saner matters took her mind off Kaji's unwanted gift. After Jane had finished all her evening correspondence, her thoughts turned immediately to food. Not Lawan, and certainly not the dream she had had in that Bangkok hotel room. If this had been a horror movie, the doll would have surprised her in the kitchen while she was eating her dinner. Cottage cheese and tomatoes with a side salad. It was fairly easy, in fact, for Jane to picture little Lawan walking out of the spare room on her tiny, stiff little legs. Then, like a doll in a horror movie, Lawan would pause at the edge of the kitchen and deliver a pronouncement of some sort in a preternatural voice. Jane chided herself for freaking herself out, which was exactly what such flights of fancy amounted to. It wouldn't hurt to check on Lawan, Jane thought, just in case. She stood up from the kitchen table and headed for the spare room. Dusty was still sleeping on the sofa, she noticed, a lazy, happily contented cat. Jane paused at the threshold of the spare room. Lawan will be gone, she thought. She won't be on the bookcase where you left her, and you'll go absolutely stark, raving mad. Jane flipped the overhead light switch before she stepped fully into the room. The doll was exactly where she had placed it roughly 2 hours ago. Lawan's cherubic smile was unsettling, as always, but there was nothing about the scene that implied any movement. About an hour later, Jane was in her bedroom, preparing to turn in, when she heard Dusty mewling from the other side of the condo, from the direction of the spare room. Once again, she pictured the worst, the most fantastic scenario: Lawan come to life, Lawan strangling her cat. She found Dusty quite unhurt. The cat lingered outside the spare bedroom. Dusty looked up at Jane and mewled in that plaintive, complaining cat way, as if to convey the message that Jane had failed in some fundamental aspect of being a master. "What's wrong, Dusty boy?" Jane walked into the spare bedroom, but not before she'd first flipped the light switch, her gaze immediately fixed upon the doll. The doll had not moved, not even a smidgen. She had expected the cat to follow her. Dusty, however, remained just outside the spare room. "Come on, boy," she said. She kneeled and gestured toward all the cat comforts on the floor near the doorway, only a few feet from the actual cat: food, water, bed, litter box. The cat would not enter the room. Still kneeling, Jane turned back toward the doll. Although she had promised herself not to talk to Lawan anymore, because Lawan was nothing but a collection of inanimate parts after all, she couldn't resist leveling an accusation. "Did you have anything to do with this, by chance?" Lawan's only response was that unchanging, lifelike smile. Jane sighed. This was a real dilemma. If Dusty wouldn't enter the room, then he wouldn't eat or drink, and without access to his litter box, he might go elsewhere to answer his calls of nature. "So you don't like that creepy doll either, huh?" Jane said to her cat. Dusty did not answer, but he swished his tail in the air. There was only one solution, short of removing the doll. Making several trips, Jane moved Dusty's things to the condo's tiny utility room adjacent to her bedroom. When she placed the cat's food dish on the floor of the utility room, the cat plunged in and gobbled Meow Mix with abandon. Dusty had clearly been hungry, but he had been unwilling to enter the spare room with Lawan atop the bookcase.